meditation on death can bring back that kind of early Christian urgency to our lives. Like, how do I want to spend this day if Jesus is coming tomorrow?
Well, hey everyone, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin. This is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we seek to bring simplicity out of theological complexity and help you in your journey of following Jesus. Today, I am joined by Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble, who is a religious sister who is known for the practice of Memento Mori, which is remembering your death. And before that, weirds you out and you're like, what are we talking about today? I think you're going to find this really helpful. It's an ancient spiritual discipline that I think you can incorporate in your life to give you greater perspective, greater clarity, and a greater relationship with this thing that is just a reality of life, which is death. And so I hope this is helpful for you. Before we jump into it, I want to say a big thank you as always to my Patreon subscribers and merch buyers who make this channel possible, especially to my patrons who give monthly to support this channel. Seriously, it means so much to me. Thank you all so much for your support. It means the world to me. If you want to support this channel, you can go to patreon.com/gospel simplicity to sign up to support this channel. Or if you want to make a one-time gift, you can go to paypal.me/gospel simplicity. I really would appreciate that. I also want to give a quick disclaimer to this video. We're going to be talking about death. And I know for some people that might be a bit of a difficult topic depending on where you're at in life. And I want to just warn you about that. It's not necessarily a graphic conversation or anything like that, but it is heavy. And so if it's not spiritually, emotionally wise for you to listen to this right now, I completely get that. And you're free to watch something else. But I do think this will be helpful for a lot of people. And as we talk about death, I always want to be sensitive to where people are at. And I will have a link in the description for a crisis line if you are experiencing any suicidal thoughts or ideations. Again, maybe I wouldn't recommend this video for that time of your life, but if you are experiencing that, please do not hesitate to reach out for the help that you need, that you should get. And with that being said, I hope you guys enjoy this video. Well, today I am joined by Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble, who is a former atheist who, thanks to the grace of God, has returned to the faith she was raised in and now tries to help others bring their loved ones back to the faith. A few years after returning to the church, she heard God calling her, so she left her job in Silicon Valley to join the Daughters of St. Paul. She is the founder of the Memento Mori project and the author of The Prodigal You Love, inviting loved ones back to the church. She now lives in Boston, where she serves at the Pauline Publishing House and the editorial department. Sister Theresa, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me on, Austin.
It is absolutely my pleasure, and I'm ready to talk about death at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning.
All right, good for you.
Before we get fully to that, I just want to ask a little bit more about your story because it seems really interesting from what I've read about it. You were an atheist for about 10 years before entering the religious life. Can you share a bit of that story?
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic, and but I always struggled with the problem of suffering, and I questioned God's existence from the age of 5. I remember the moment where I had that thought, what if God doesn't exist? And so I always kind of struggled and wrestled with things. My father was a theologian, so at the dinner table, I'd ask him lots of questions about different things. And but I was never satisfied with the responses to the problem of suffering. So when I was 14, kind of initiated by suffering in my own family and in my own life, I came to the conclusion that I really just couldn't accept that a good God existed with all the suffering in the world. So I became an atheist at that age, and I was an atheist till beyond college. And but in my atheism, I was still searching for answers, and I was searching in other religious traditions as well. And so in college, I was involved in animal rights. I was the president of the animal rights group. I was a vegan. I was very involved in it. And my boyfriend at the time was in philosophy. I was in political philosophy, but we discussed philosophy around animal rights. And I always struggled with the idea that There wasn't anything that separated human animal life from other animal life. And I struggled with the idea of speciesism, which in animal rights is the idea that if you think that human life is more valuable in any sense than animal life, then you're a speciesist, which is a pejorative term. So I kind of wrestled with that. And the reason that I was wrestling with that now that I look back on it was because I was intuitively understanding the idea of the soul. And so I wrestled with that for a really long time. I would always kind of come back to that and come back to it. And so intellectually, I think I came to the point where I believed that the soul existed, and that the human soul was different than an animal soul. But I didn't go from that to God's existence, mainly because I think I just had so many personal blockages to that. And so God helped me out of that intellectual conundrum, really, because he there was a moment of grace where he just infused me with his grace. I was in Costa Rica. I was working on a farm, and the working on a farm, I think, was really helpful to get me into a contemplative mode where I was more open to hearing God. And one morning I was walking to the farm. It was really early in the morning, and I looked around at all of the mountains. And in that moment, I realized that though this beauty around me had a cause, and that I had a cause. It was an odd moment because I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the world, but at the same time there was a huge gust of wind, and I felt like a tree was going to fall on me. So I was kind of fearing for my life, and at the same time overwhelmed by beauty. But I think that was like that realization of the fragility of my being helped me to understand that my being had a cause, and that God was that cause. And the grace of that was that God helped me to realize in that moment that it wasn't just some distant, uncaused cause. It was a personal God who loved me and cared for me and had a plan for my life. And so from that moment on, my life completely changed, because I believed God and I believed he had a plan for my life, and I wanted to figure out what that was.
Wow. What a wonderful story, and so interesting, the angle that you came at this from. And I know that today, especially in kind of like atheist Christian dialogues, that the problem of animal suffering is a big one. So it's interesting that you were kind of thinking about that at the time. Just really fascinating stuff. And it kind of gets into the title of your ministry, Pursued by Truth. It's kind of an interesting play on words, I think, for people, because most of us think that we're pursuing truth, but it kind of flips that a bit. And could you describe a bit how that just is like a reflection of your story?
Yeah, that was always a phrase that I chose. I used to blog a lot, and that was the name of my blog. And when I took my first vows for religious life, I chose the name Aletheia, which in Greek it means truth. And so truth has always been very central to my journey. And it's funny because I did almost choose pursuing truth or something along those lines. But as I prayed with it, I realized that I always, even when I was an atheist, and I don't say even, it was really because my atheism was a search for truth. I wanted to know the truth, and it actually was one of the moments that kind of led me into thinking about Christianity and thinking about more spiritual things was the death of one of my friends. And in that moment, I wasn't looking for comfort, but I wanted to know the truth. I've always wanted to know the truth, whether it's a difficult truth or a comfortable truth or in between, which is usually in between. It's like a paradoxical truth. But so in that moment of my conversion, I realized that what I had been searching for that entire time was not some cold, hard fact. It was a person. And that person had been searching for me the entire time and reaching out to me, because we can kind of put our emphasis in our spiritual journey on ourselves and what we're doing. But even when I was unaware of God's existence and rejected it, I know that he was with me and that he was pursuing me that entire time. So that's where that phrase comes from.
I really love that. And one of my favorite things about getting to do what I do here on this channel is getting to hear people's story. And I find that to be a common theme in people's story of seeking after something only to realize that they're being sought as well, which is such a beautiful just image of the Christian life. I want to
Yeah.
ask a bit. So there's a bit of a gap in the story between you're in Costa Rica at this farm, you have this experience of the beauty of the world and kind of the fear of death, or the possibility of it at least. And then you enter the religious life, which I feel like for a lot of people, they're going to be like, wow, that's a big jump from, the world's beautiful and God might exist to like, I'm going to become a nun. Is a nun an accurate term? You can let me know.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
kind of like the slang term.
Okay.
Technically, a nun is cloistered, so there are
Okay.
cloistered nuns who don't leave the convent, and I'm a religious sister technically, but
Religious sister. Okay.
people use the phrase nun too.
Well, that's good to know. I'm
Yeah,
learning. And
yeah,
we talked right before. My audience probably knows more of this lingo than I do. So this is great. But so what was that journey like to becoming a religious sister? And I'll say you're the first religious sister I've had on the channel. I've had several priests, and others, and a couple monks, but you're the first religious sister. So I'd be curious, going from like a political philosophy student, to being a religious sister, what was that like? What led you to that? And maybe how is that compared to what you expected?
yeah. It's funny because my intellectual struggles were actually very incremental and slow. But from the moment where God revealed himself to me and I knew that he existed, my life completely changed and things began to move a lot more quickly because I was in relationship with God and I was asking him questions, I was praying, I was just kind of in constant communication with him. So after my conversion, a lot of people assume that I immediately became Catholic again. And at that point, I, I would say it crossed my mind that, oh, I wonder if Jesus is God. But I really just believed in God's existence. I didn't believe in the Trinity. I didn't believe in Jesus. But when I got on the plane going back from Costa Rica, I had gotten into law school. I had a boyfriend who I planned to marry. I had all these different things that I had planned. But God had made very clear to me that he had a plan for my life. And so I thought to myself, okay, here's this all powerful, all loving being who created me, who has a plan for me, and versus my plan, what's going to win? I'm going to go with his plan, but I have no idea what that is. So I got back from that trip, and on the plane, I just decided I'm not going to go to law school. I probably won't continue the relationship with the boyfriend I was with, and I was just going to figure out what God's plan was for me. And so that it moved rather quickly, and it felt quick for me too. I was just kind of shocked by where God led me. I did not want to become Catholic again. I had a lot of resistances to joining the Catholic Church. I really was completely uninterested in that. But I also didn't quite know whether I believed that Jesus was God either. So that was a huge obstacle, obviously. But over time, I just felt over and over and over again God kind of steering me towards the Catholic Church, and I felt I intellectually I came back to the Catholic Church before my intellect was far behind. I knew that's where God was leading me, so I just thought I'm just gonna make the plunge and trust that this is what God is really where He's actually leading me. And so it was a few years after my conversion when again, religious life hadn't even crossed my mind. Through scripture, I was really I was coming to a relationship with Jesus also, and a belief that Jesus is God. And so but I wasn't thinking about religious life at all. And one day I was just traveling and I saw a sister out of the corner of my eye. And I looked over and it was actually just a normal person walking. So religious life started to just kind of be put on my mind. And but still, I just thought, oh, I must be thinking about God a lot, and that must be what's happening. And all of a sudden, one day, it occurred to me that maybe God was asking me to think about religious life. And at that point, I had followed where God led up until that point, kind of, okay, I'll do this, I'll do this. But at that point, I was like, oh no, like that's just not something I am interested in at all. So I was actually kind of irritated at God. I felt, that passage in Jeremiah where he says, "You duped me, Lord, and I let myself be duped." Um, uh, and another translation is, "You seduced me, Lord, and I let myself be seduced." But that's kind of, it's interesting because I definitely felt duped at first, and now I feel more like it was a love relationship, and God was inviting me into a love relationship. But yeah, so that's how I started to discern religious life. And pretty soon after that, he made it clear to me that that's where he was calling me. It took me many years after that to actually accept that invitation. But yeah, that's how that
Wow,
happened.
that's such a journey, and I love the way that you put that. And the reference to Jeremiah there is great, especially with that duped translation. That's a really wonderful way of describing that. I appreciate you sharing that. Uh, I want to talk a bit about what you have become, I guess, like most well known for. And this references back if people are confused when I said I'm ready to talk about death at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning. But this practice of Memento Mori, it seems that it's not that you originated this practice, but you have kind of popularized it to a new generation, at least in my understanding. And so for those that aren't familiar at all, what is this practice of Memento Mori? Hey, we'll be right back to the interview, but first I want to tell you about another sponsor for today, and that is Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is a group of Christian counselors that exist to help you get the help you need. One of the first YouTube videos I ever made was called "You Can Have Jesus and a Therapist Too." And what I wanted to do in that video was draw out the fact that so many people are struggling with mental health, and the last thing we want to do is make it more difficult for people to reach out to get the help they need by creating this stigma around it. It's something that I'm really passionate about and think we need to end in Christian circles. And that's why I'm so excited to be partnering with Faithful Counseling. Their counselors all will be counseling from a Christian perspective, and you can connect with them from any country in the world. They have counselors that speak many different languages. And hey, if it's important to you to have a counselor from your specific tradition or background, they can do their part to try to pair you up with one of them as well. All of their counselors are licensed with over 3,000 hours of experience. You can connect with these counselors in a variety of ways. In fact, you can do video sessions, phone calls, live chat, or messaging. All of the messaging is secure, and if it's between scheduled sessions, you'll receive a response within 24 to 48 hours. If this is interesting to you, if you think this would be helpful for you or maybe a loved one, I'd encourage you to go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity. If you do that, first of all, you'll get 10% off your order, and you will be matched with a counselor in less than 24 hours. Again, that's faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity to be matched with a counselor in less than 24 hours and get 10% off your first month. Faithful Counseling costs $260 per month, which gets you unlimited messaging with your counselor in 4 30-minute sessions. But again, if you go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity, you'll get 10% off that first month. Lastly, Faithful Counseling is not a crisis line. If you are currently experiencing suicidal thoughts or ideation, please reach out to a crisis line or hotline. You can find one of them at www.crisistextline.org. Please do so and reach out. You do not have to do this alone. Well, thank you all so much, and I will let you get back to the video. But if you want to check them out, again, faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity. The link is in my bio and in the pinned comment. Well, back to the interview.
So the reason I started to meditate on my death, and that is the practice of Memento Mori, is like regular meditation on death. It sounds very morbid and strange to people who haven't heard about it before. But I was introduced to it through the founder of my religious order, James Alberione. And he kept a skull on his desk and regularly meditated on his death. And I read about that in a book, in one of his biographies at some point. And I thought, that's really punk rock. I'm going to do that sometime. But I didn't totally understand why he would do that or what that was about. But then I it was actually 7 years into the convent that I felt kind of inspired by the Holy Spirit to begin it and try it out. And I still, again, didn't really know what I was doing. And I mentioned at dinner that I was thinking of doing this, and a sister said, "Well, I have a skull that you could use." So she gave me this little ceramic skull. I put it on my desk, and then I was like, now what? How do you do this? Like, I knew that Saint Benedict, like in the 6th century, had told his monks in his rule, keep death daily before your eyes. So that's like an exhortation to meditate on death. But I thought, what does that exactly mean? And so I just thought, I'm just going to bring it to mind every day. And I'm going to look at the skull, and I'm going to bring my death to mind, and I'm going to think about it and see what happens. And so I started to do that. But as I did it, our sister's mission in the church is to use modern media to spread the gospel. So I tweeted about it. I just decided I'll just tweet about it for a while to get into the habit. And people were really interested in what I was doing. Partly, I think, because some of them thought I had a human skull on my desk. I had to like make sure they understood that I was a ceramic skull. but people were interested in and trying to understand, like, what was I doing? Why was I doing this? And that made me realize, well, I need to kind of figure out, what am I doing? And at the same time, every time I went to Mass, we go to Mass every single day. And at Mass, there's a reading. In the daily Mass, there's an Old Testament reading and a reading from the Gospel. And then Sunday Mass has 3 readings. And every reading, I was just seeing like exhortations to think about the fragility of our life, our mortality, how God has created us, and to really just to think about death. And so I was hearing these exhortations in Scripture over and over and over again. And so I think it was God's way of helping me to see the roots of this tradition in the church. And as I was meditating on my death every day and bringing it to mind, it was really changing my life. Like, I would say, my biggest conversion is when I went from atheist to theist, but this is my second biggest conversion, was when I began to meditate on death. And I just experienced it was a conduit for just so many graces from God.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I love that you described it as your first reaction to hearing about it. Like, that's really punk rock. That's fantastic. I'm curious, so I imagine the reaction within the religious life might be a bit different. And you talked a little bit about the Twitter reaction, but when you first put even ceramic skull on your desk, it sounds like there was a lot of people that were intrigued because it's different. Was there anyone that was like a little concerned? Like, what are you doing here, Sister Theresa, with the skull on your desk?
Definitely. Um, Even among my sisters, which my sisters know that Blessed James Alberione kept a skull on his desk. So you kind of can't deny that our founder did it. So it can't be, it's a little odd, but it can't be wrong. And some of our older sisters remember when meditation on death was much more normal in the Catholic culture. It really was much more normal up until maybe the 50s. Our founder noticed that it was starting to die out and that people were doing it less and less. So my sisters understood. They thought it was weird, but one of my sisters came into my office at one point and said, "So I saw on Twitter that you're meditating on your death now." She's like, "That's really weird, but that's also, I'm not surprised. It's Sister Aletheia." So, so my sisters kind of accepted it in stride. It was a little, we run a publishing house, and so when I saw people were asking for resources to actually incorporate meditation on death into their life, and I decided to propose the projects that to do like a journal and a Lenten devotional and things. The sisters were a little bit more unsure about that. Like, publishing a book with a skull on it was a little, it was more edgy than they were used to. Among Catholics, I would say there are people who are like me who kind of have, I listened to punk rock when I was in high school. So the imagery of the skull is not as off-putting to me. So some people who are kind of into different kinds of music or into that imagery, they feel an affinity with it. Others who associate it with like evil things were very put off by it. And I definitely had people who came to me with a lot of concern, saying, "Sister, this seems satanic. I'm worried for your soul. Like I'm wondering what's going on." But I think a lot of that is rooted just in ignorance about what that symbolism in the Christian tradition means. In the US, we just don't have a lot of skull symbolism that is associated with religious things. But if you go to Europe, there's a lot of skull symbolism, like throughout the centuries, that the church associated with the resurrection of the body and different beliefs that we have. So it gives us a more positive spin. I kind of had to, meditation on death helped me to begin to see the skull differently, to see it more positively. But
giving the skull a rebrand for American Catholics.
Exactly.
And I have to say the skull wallpapers and the journal, like the art that you guys do with the skulls is really beautiful and really neat. It almost makes you, it kind of does rebrand it in a way. You're looking at death, which has such a one connotation in so many people's mind. And then even just the imagery, it makes you think like they're coming at this differently, and it's intriguing. And you made a note that your founder noticed around the 50s that even within like American Catholic circles, people started thinking about death less. And it seems to me that might be like a uniquely modern gift, that we can even choose to not think about death. For most of history, it was just everywhere around us all the time, even though it still is in many ways today. But I'd be curious your thoughts. Why do you think it is that reflecting on our death kind of fell out of style, if you will?
That's a really good question. Our founder was in Italy at the time, so he noticed it in Italian culture, but it was also true in U.S. culture as well. I've spoken to I have a religious friend who is a brother, and he's in his 80s, and he said that when he was in formation, he received a prayer book that had a picture of a skull on it and said, "As I am, so you will be." It was just a very normal thing to kind of have this imagery and to consider it. I I don't know exactly why. People have asked me this question before, and I've kind of hypothesized that maybe the early 20th century was so violent and there was so much death in the world wars that people wanted to kind of reject that. Um, but I think there's something in the modern mindset that, especially in the United States, as our culture advanced, death was kind of relegated to a corner, and we can live our lives without actually seeing people die, without even funerals are kind of sanitized, and very often the casket is closed. So I would say the US is in particular like more sanitized in terms of its view of death, because even Italian culture is still much more death friendly. Like, for instance, when our founder died in the 70s, it was a normal thing for them to take pictures of the dead body, and you kept it as a memento. When they sent that, so the Italian sisters received that and were like, "Oh, I'll put it in my prayer book." The American sisters received that and they're like, "What the heck is, like, what is wrong with that?" So I don't know what that mentality is and why it's particularly strong in Americans, but yeah, it definitely is. I think that's why this practice is so important for us.
Yeah, and I want to dive in a bit to kind of what this practice brings out. And you've talked, broadly about how it's brought so many graces to your life. And I think some people might be connecting dots and others might be like, how does thinking about death help? Like, that's just scary, and I don't want to do that. And it's an interesting note you made about funerals as well. It made me think back to an interview I did with, it was an Orthodox monk, but he was talking about how confused he was by like American Christians with our closed caskets and like kind of hiding bodies. He's like here, like come to Eastern Europe and like we've got just bodies out for days. Like you'll see the dead when we have very different relationships, which is just
Yeah.
interesting for people to think about the way that we do funerals in general. But I want to come back to kind of like the importance behind this. Why, as Christians, especially in an age and in a place where we don't like thinking about death, we live as though it's not coming, even though we all kind of know it's coming sooner or later. We like to think later. Why is it important for Christians to reflect upon their deaths?
It So I think one of the main things it reasons why it's important is because it prepares us for death. And I think when I think about the fact that I could die tomorrow, it it changes the way that I think about my spiritual life. And so, what has helped me to do, when I first joined the convent, I remember saying to God, okay, I will do this. But if I'm going to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, like I want to be, I want to like really bring people to you, and I want there to be fruit from this. And I don't want to become a mediocre religious sister. And I need your grace to do that because without you, I will do that. And 7 years after being in the convent, I was just noticing that in a lot of ways my fervor would diminish. Um, I would often, and I think this is a human natural thing, is to just think there will be time. There will be time for that spiritual practice that I want to do. There will be time for me to pray more when I'm in retirement. There will be time to do this and this and this. And I think actually the devil uses that as a temptation in our life often. And this practice for me was God's way of reminding me that actually you might not have time. You could die tomorrow. So if that's the case, how do you want to live this day? How do you want to ask for my grace to live this day? And so that just changed my perspective. And I think I'm always struck by the early Christians' perspective that they believed that the end of the world was near. Um, the end of the world could be near, but we've kind of lost that sense of urgency behind that, because, well, it's been 2,000 years. So if it hasn't ended yet, it might not end in my lifetime. But meditation on death can bring back that kind of early Christian urgency to our lives. Like, how do I want to spend this day if Jesus is coming tomorrow? It just brings, for me, it has just brought more perspective. And it has helped me to grow more focused on the presence of God within me and how I want to be prepared to meet him at the moment of my death, whenever that might be.
That's a great way of putting that. I think for so many people, it takes losing someone close to them to realize that, oh, yeah, like that thing called death that I'd been conveniently avoiding is real. And it takes kind of that traumatic experience. But it doesn't have to. We're all able to reflect on death and be reminded that our death is coming. And it does have such a powerful way of changing people's perspective. And I think oftentimes, you might know someone who lost someone and then they live their life entirely differently because they realize that life is fragile and life is short in many ways. And I think it's an opportunity for all of us to not have to go through that, but to start living in a way that's aligned with what we truly think is important. And I love that you made that note about thinking that we have time, because I know for so many people kind of in my phase of life in college, they often kind of drift from the church and it's like, well, like this is my college years. Like I can do my thing. I'll come back around, when I settle down, it'll all be good.
Mm-hmm.
But you never know. And not that I think death should be the only reason that you care about spiritual things, but it does have a way of kind of silencing your pride in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to kind of ask about the inverse. So thinking about death brings these things. What do you think our discomfort with death tells us about our views of life and the life to come, even as Christians? Because we say we believe one thing about death and heaven and all of these things, but yet we often live in such a way that death is uncomfortable and death is something we don't want to think about or are terrified of. What does that say about us?
Yeah, I think so. I think something that I've really believed since coming from atheism into Catholicism is that a lot of Christians, including myself, will live our faith as practical atheists. And we'll say one thing, but our lives kind of belie other beliefs. And it's sometimes it can be hard for us to admit that. We can say, "Oh, I have a great relationship with God. I have a prayer life. I do this. I do that." But is my first priority God? Because if we really believe in God, then our first priority should be God. And so when I was in the convent, I it was very embarrassing to me to admit to myself that my first priority still wasn't God. Outwardly, I had made this great sacrifice, and I was taking vows of poverty, chastity, obedience to dedicate my entire life to God. But it's part I think it's part of human nature, really, to just become unfocused and to be self-centered and to think about ourselves. So for me, I think that the meditation on death can help us to be real with ourselves, to really get to the core of what we believe. Meditation on death can bring up all of our fears, all of our fears that I think Christians very easily kind of plaster over. They're like, "Oh, I'm not afraid of death. It's really not that big of a deal. I believe in the resurrection." And even when someone dies, you can see kind of this Pollyannish, like, "Oh, she's going to heaven," and big smiles on our faces. But it's not really coming to terms with what death is. Death is a punishment for sin. It is not a good thing, but Christ has also transformed it. So it's a paradoxical truth that entering into it can really shake us to the core. So it can be scary for us to do that, really.
Yeah, I think it is unnerving for a lot of people to really come to terms with death. And I really appreciate you sharing that even in the religious life, having taken these vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, you can come to this place of realizing I'm not living with Christ as the most important thing in my life and following him. I could be living in many ways like a practical atheist, or I find many people kind of hedging their bets. It's like, I'm going to live like a Christian, but I'm also going to live kind of not like a Christian just in case I'm wrong, even though they might
Hmm.
not articulate that. I want to ask, as if people, take this and they start thinking about their death, and in doing so, they realize, I'm kind of living like a practical atheist. What do they do with that data? What did you do with that data point? Because I could see for some that could just create this kind of like shame spiral of like, I'm so bad. Like, how I said I was doing this. And maybe in your case, like, I'm a religious sister. Like, what is wrong with me? How am I doing this? But we know like that's not really productive. And so how do you come out of that and make a change and allow that experience, that realization, to be something that helps you move forward?
Yeah, I think that is what one of the main things that distinguishes meditation on death kind of in a secular view and meditation on death in the Christian view. Meditation on death in the secular view, and some Christians can kind of fall into this, is meditation on death is to make me strong and sleek and holy, and shiny. Um, and yes, we want to be holy, but meditation on death, in my experience, has brought me right up to my weakness and my need for God. And so if people come to that realization as they're meditating on death, like, I don't know if I really believe in heaven, that's good. That is good. That is honest and good. I worry about people who say to me, "I've been meditating on my death and I'm not scared of it at all anymore, sister." Like, they're proud of it and they're just telling me this, and they're like, uh, I think maybe I would invite you to pray with it more, because it shouldn't be bringing us to a place where we're kind of like above other people. it's actually brings us to a place of nearness to our weakness and our need for God, because that's where the grace comes in. The grace doesn't come in our ability to kind of make ourselves holy because we are meditating on our death. The grace comes in when meditation on death brings us face to face with our weakness, and we say, wow, I really need God. Not just on Sundays, but every single moment of my life, I need God.
Yeah, and isn't that the paradoxical nature of the spiritual life, is that often the practices that result in the most growth are those that make us realize our great need for God. If your spiritual disciplines are making you feel higher and holier, they might not be really working for you, which
Yeah.
is such an interesting part of following Jesus. I want to ask, for those that are hearing this and they're like, okay, she's got a point. This Memento Mori thing sounds like it's something I maybe should try. Like, I think this could be good, but like, that still kind of freaks me out. What is like the first step they can take to implementing this in their life?
You know, I think it's really important to do it regularly. But when people say, oh gosh, you're asking me to meditate on my death every single day, that sounds really scary. But it's really, even if it's just for a moment. And so that's the first most important thing, is regularity. Just bring your death to mind regularly, not every once in a while, because why should we freak ourselves out like periodically? It's really in the regularity that, for me, what I've experienced is it brings up a lot of anxiety, but that anxiety does diminish over time. And I'm not saying I'm no longer fearful of death, but I definitely can say that I'm less afraid of death because of this practice. But I was going to say something else, but I lost it. Oh, the second thing is that prayer, in the context of prayer, because it can become like this thing that we do instead of this thing that we bring to Jesus. So that second most important thing is we bring it to mind, but then whatever it brings up, we bring to God in prayer. And it can be 30 seconds a day. It really can be a very simple, brief time of prayer. But if people already have a time of prayer set aside, this is a really good thing to kind of incorporate into your regular prayer.
Thanks for that. And I appreciate the note on regularity. I think we all can recognize, no matter what habit we're trying to form, whether that's eating better or that's going to the gym or we're trying to learn how to play guitar. Like, none of these things really get better if we don't do them consistently. But for some reason, we often think that those same principles don't necessarily apply to the spiritual life. And then we wonder why we're not growing.
Mm-hmm.
For those that, maybe I should take it even a step further back, because I think most people are going to just kind of intuit what meditating on death might look like, but others might not. They might be like, what does that even mean to meditate on your death? Am I supposed to like think about all the crazy ways I could die and get like really worked up about it? Am I supposed to be trying to come to terms with death? When you say meditating on death, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it can look different for different people, because I've heard from some people they have a really difficult time imagining anything. So that makes meditation on death difficult. One of the things that I just emphasize when people get kind of caught up in how do I do this, is that just do it. But the second thing is there are practical helps in our spiritual tradition that can help us to incorporate this into our prayer life. One of them is I found a lot of help in Saint Ignatius. He's the founder of the Jesuits order, and he encouraged people to imagine yourself on your deathbed. So if you're making a decision for something, you imagine that scene. How do you want that scene to look? That was really helpful to me in discerning whether I wanted to stay in the convent, because I imagined myself on my deathbed and I was able to imagine all of my sisters around me. And that brought me peace. But I do it with little decisions too. Like I imagine myself on my deathbed, like what would I want to do today if I were to die tomorrow? Another thing to do is to imagine like sudden death. and to bring that to mind, not like obsessively. And if that is a tendency, that might not be the best thing to do. But I do think of myself dying in a car accident or something sudden, because sometimes in meditation on death, we have a tendency to think of ourselves as living until old age. But the reality is that we do have to remind ourselves that death could come at any time and we could die tomorrow. Another thing that St. Ignatius again encourages people to do as a spiritual practice is called an examen. And so at the end of the day, you review your day in the presence of God. And if you Google it, you'll find lots of different versions of it. I put a version of it in all of the resources that our sisters published that incorporates an explicit step on considering, like, if I were to die tomorrow, how would I consider this day? So that's kind of a good way, if you're reviewing your day with Jesus, to kind of incorporate that and say, if I were to die tomorrow, how would I wanted to live this day differently? And how would I want to live tomorrow differently if I knew I were to die at the end of the day? And Jesus, what are the graces that I need to be close to you in view of that possibility of death?
I really like the way that tied in with the examen there. And to make a shameless plug, I had the joy of doing an interview with Father Mark Thibodeau on the prayer of examen. So if people want to learn more, they can check that out, or his book where he gives a ridiculous number of variations on the prayer of examen. I've found that to be a really helpful thing. And I think it's really neat when we can connect spiritual practices, because sometimes it feels like we're learning so many and we're like, how do we fit these all together? Like, do I have to like make a schedule? Like Monday I've got this, and it can become
Right.
overwhelming. It's like too many tools. But when you realize what they're aiming at, I feel like you can kind of get a better sense of how these things work together, how you might be able to pair them. And rather than just being a rote practice of a certain form, you're understanding where you're trying to get, and you can use these as tools, which I think is helpful. For people that are starting to take the jump into this, I appreciate that you said, it started with some anxiety around these things, and not that it's completely gone, but it does get better over time. And I feel like that might be encouraging for people if they start this tomorrow and they're like, I'm anxious. Am I doing something wrong? Along those lines, I think it's sometimes helpful to ask, what are maybe some of the dangers you see that people, or what are some pitfalls people can avoid with insight that you've gotten from yourself or seeing other people start this? And I hate to say do it wrong, but maybe just go down paths that are unhelpful. What are those things that people should be preemptively aware of?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I think the main thing that I have noticed, and I noticed it in myself too, is that like a lot of spiritual practices, we can fall into the pitfall of pelagianism, where we think that we're actually just making ourselves holy through the practice, and it's not actually just a opening for God to give us His grace. Another thing that I've noticed is that, this can happen a lot in our Christian kind of attitude towards the outside world, is like a triumphalism, kind of like, my Christianity has made me so good, look at me, or this. And I've noticed this in the pandemic especially, is Christians kind of wearing their lack of fear of death very almost like bragging. To me, that is not what Memento Mori is about. Memento Mori is actually getting in touch with the fact that death is frightening. And if it doesn't frighten us, then we're not understanding what death is. Ripping your soul from your body is a scary thing. Like, it is always going to be a scary thing. There's not going to be a point in our life where we're like, big deal, So it's normal to be frightened of death. And in fact, if we are kind of, pridefully acting like we are not, that's not at all. That's actually the opposite of what Memento Mori is about. But I do notice in some secular versions of meditation on death, like some of the strains in like Stoicism and things like that, at modern day Stoicism, can fall into that. And then Christians take it up and kind of think of it as the Christian meditation on death. But I think that's one of the biggest pitfalls, is because the meditation on death is about centering our lives on Jesus. And if it brings us away from that center and our dependence on Jesus and our need for Jesus, then it's kind of doing the opposite of what it's really intended. It's probably not the most helpful spiritual practice to be doing if that's where we're ending up.
Yeah, what a great kind of thermometer or gauge to use there for so many things. Is this drawing us closer to Jesus? And I really appreciate the note about triumphalism. That it's so easy to allow that into our spiritual lives, but it's cancerous to our spiritual growth, and it can take these things that can be so positive and actually use them just for pride, which is such an easy thing to fall into, but can be so destructive in how we relate to ourselves and to others, and to use this as a comparative tool. So thank you for those things. I think it's always really helpful to know if there are things on the road that you should be avoiding. That's why like driving with Waze is so convenient. It's like, oh, there's a car stuck on the road ahead. Don't hit it. There's police up ahead. All those things. They help us on our way so that we can be prepared in advance. If we don't have to learn from our own mistakes, life is a little easier sometimes when we get to learn maybe from what other people have already experienced. We've talked broadly about all the ways this has been beneficial, and to you and to so many others who have picked up this practice. If there was one thing that you could pinpoint in your life that you'd say, like, this is the biggest impact it's had for me personally, what would that be?
That's a good question. I think mainly the perspective that it's given me, and I've had a desire to grow closer to Jesus and to kind of Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity. She was a Carmelite sister. She has these beautiful meditations on kind of centering on Jesus in our through our baptism, who dwells within us, the Trinity that dwells within us through our baptism, and that baptismal centering and union with God. And it always seemed like such a beautiful thing, but this practice has really helped me to kind of center back on it. It's just a way to kind of continually come back to Jesus and come back to the presence of God. Um, it's I've grown frustrated with the need for that, because sometimes I just wish that God would just like ding, kind of make it happen, like, oh, you're always focused on me now. Congratulations. But I think this practice has helped me to also accept my humanity and my weakness, and to not hate it, but to love it. This is the way that God created me. And, I am a sinner in need of a savior, and he's going to help me to grow closer to him. But it's going to take my constant returning to him and constant returning to him. It's not like one big conversion that's going to suddenly make everything okay. The Christian life is continual conversion and turning towards Jesus. And so this has been just of all the things that I've tried, aside from the sacraments and the grace of the sacraments, this has been helpful to me in returning continually to Jesus.
What a wonderful testimony to how this has impacted you. I thank you so much for your time today. I want to ask one final-ish question, and that is, it seems to me that a lot of this relates to kind of changing our relationship with death, that in a secular sense, we have one relationship to it, or in like a pseudo-Christian, like a veneer of Christianity painted over a really secular life or worldview, we have one way of looking at it and relating to death. And that Memento Mori is teaching us to change our relationship with death. How should a Christian relate to death? You've talked about the fact that this should still be scary. And I imagine some people, they might, like you said, they get this Pollyanna sense of death.
Mm-hmm.
Can Christians still mourn death? I recognize anytime I put out a video that there's people listening to this in all different moments of life. And there might be people listening to this that just lost someone. I mean, with COVID still going on, I know we're seeing people die all the time, and just the craziness of life, people die. And there might be people mourning. And I wouldn't want them to come across this and think, am I doing something wrong for being sad right now? And so what would you say to people like that in general? how do we relate to death?
Yeah, I think it's a misunderstanding of the Christian view of death in Christian circles when we act like mourning is just something we should get over and move on. Um, Death is an evil. God did not create death, as Scripture tells us. So, um, but at the same time, it can be difficult because we get kind of conflicting messages about it. Like Saint Athanasius in his in the on the incarnation, he writes like, he who is put on the faith of the cross despises what is naturally fearful, and for Christ's sake is not afraid of death. And that, I remember when I first read that, I thought, I am afraid of death. Like, does that mean that don't have faith in the cross? Or I think sometimes we don't realize that these kind of sentiments, even in Scripture, are goals. They're not where we should be. And I think that's the mistake that we make, is I should be at this goal. And I call it like a Memento Mori black belt, when you're at the point where you can actually look forward to death. I'm not at that point, but you do see it in the saints. You just see it in St. Paul. He wants to be with Christ. He desires death to a certain extent. And so that is kind of our goal. But it's normal to kind of to not be at that goal, and it's definitely not normal to live that goal your entire life. These are like, because again, there are moments where we can feel this infusion of grace from God, and we can say that you see it in the martyrs when they're going to their death and they're singing. Like, could they do that every day? Probably not. But God gave them a special grace in that moment to sing as they walk towards their death. So God may give us special graces in the moment to accept death but mourning is a process. And that's not going to be something that just disappears in a second. That's something that in that process, we may experience infusions of grace where we are, feel so close to our loved one. We feel confident that they are in heaven. We feel confident that God is a loving God and all of those things. But then there are other moments where we just feel our humanity. And I think those are moments where God is closest to us, because it's in our need that he is closest to us. So I think the shoulds and how we should look at death are what get us in trouble. It's more like an accepting the reality of what we're experiencing and how we're feeling, and bringing it to Jesus in prayer.
I really like that. And should can often be such a well-meaning but harmful word in our relationship with so many things, because it can create that sense of guilt or shame around things that really end up being counterproductive. In the spirit of also, in that same spirit of knowing that there's people in all different places listening to this, as we talk about that kind of black belt of Memento Mori, of like desiring your death. And this video will actually have an ad for a counseling service, and there'll be like a crisis line on there. But I just want to put in a note, and I'm sure you would be thinking along these same lines of, even at that level, desiring your death is a completely different thing than desiring to bring about your death. And if anyone is struggling with thoughts like that, there will be a resource in that ad for a crisis line. But please hear us that when we're saying that, is a completely different thing than having suicidal thoughts or ideation. And so I just want to put in that plug, in that if you're having those thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out to people who are qualified to help you with those things.
Thank you.
With that being said, I know that's a dark note to end on there, but I always want to make sure I'm thinking of the different places people might be in.
Yeah.
As we conclude, I'd love for you to let people know where they can find more of your work, and as well as just any closing thoughts you'd like to give to people as they set out on this journey of Memento Mori.
Yeah, I really appreciate, Austin, that you brought up suicide and suicidal ideation, because I think that's something that people can think about when they're thinking about meditation on death. And as this is kind of like always when we're speaking about something so deep and so mysterious, the truths in it are paradoxical. So you can elevate one, but then there's another. And one of them is, Jesus has transformed death, so in that sense we can desire it. But in another sense, our life is good. Our life is good, and your life is good. Every single person watching this, your life is good, and God loves you into existence. And so Memento Mori is really about that, both of those things. Like, our life is good, and God loves you. And death, and that is why he came to earth and died for us, to transform death, so that death would not be the end, so that we would meet him in heaven. And so, yeah, I really appreciate you kind of bringing that, like, in those paradoxical truths, like raising that very important truth to the surface. And if you're looking for resources for meditation on death, you can find them. You can find the links for them at pursuedbytruth.com. That's my website, and you can find more information about Memento Mori. You can also find our sisters' books in general at paulinestore.com. And you can find me online at Pursued by Truth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sister Theresa Aletheia, for being here today. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I hope people really enjoy this opportunity to think about a new spiritual practice and see how that can impact their life. I think this will be new for a lot of people and also really helpful. And I want to thank everyone who watches this sometime in the future. I don't take your time lightly. I really appreciate you being here and sticking around to this point. I really value that. And I'll close, as I always do, by saying until next time, be on the lookout for more videos. And most importantly, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.